My husband mocked my dreams until one day he had to work for me. At first glance, their marriage seemed ideal. A beautiful house, comfortable lives, and a husband with a stable, well-paying job. To outsiders, it appeared that she was living every woman's dream. But behind closed doors, reality was far from perfect. From the moment they got married, her husband had always been the dominant voice in their relationship, making decisions without ever considering her thoughts. Whenever she tried to discuss her ambitions, he would scoff, brushing them off as childish fantasies. He claimed she should be grateful for what she had, that there was no need for her to pursue anything beyond being a supportive wife. Though his words stung, she convinced herself that maybe he was right. Maybe dreaming was foolish. Yet, deep inside, something refused to be silenced. Ever since she was young, she had harbored a passion for business. While others spent their free time watching TV or going out, she found herself fascinated by marketing strategies, financial trends, and the thrill of building something from nothing. Before marriage, she had envisioned a future where she could turn this passion into something real, something she could call her own. But every time she mentioned the idea, her husband laughed. He told her she wasn't cut out for it, that she had no experience and no chance of competing in a world dominated by men. "Stick to what you know," he would say dismissively. "And what you know is running this household." For years, she swallowed the humiliation. Every time they attended gatherings with his colleagues, she played the role of the quiet, agreeable wife, smiling as he made jokes at her expense. When people asked about her interests, he would cut in before she could answer. "She just likes wasting money on silly projects," he'd say, and the room would erupt in laughter. Each time, her face would burn with embarrassment, but she never defended herself. It was easier to let him believe she had given up. In truth, she hadn't. Late at night, while he snored beside her, she would stay awake, sketching out ideas, researching market trends, and quietly laying the groundwork for something he would never see coming. It started with an idea, one she believed in more than anything. She had noticed a gap in the market, a demand that wasn't being met. While her husband dismissed her as someone without real-world knowledge, she knew better. She understood people, understood what they wanted, even if they didn't realize it yet. But the moment she told him about her plans, she regretted it instantly. He didn't just laugh, he ridiculed her mercilessly. "You," he scoffed, nearly choking on his morning coffee. "You think you can run a business? That's adorable." "Really, it is." The words hit harder than she expected, not because she believed them, but because they came from someone who was supposed to support her. Instead, he took pleasure in making her feel small. "You have no experience, no background, and let's be honest, no real talent for this. You wouldn't last a month." The worst part was how effortlessly the insult left his lips, as if crushing her dreams was no different from discussing the weather. She wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but years of being put down had conditioned her to stay silent. So she nodded, pretended to agree, and let him believe he had won. But that night, when he went to sleep, she sat at her desk and worked harder than ever. If he thought she was incapable, then she would prove him wrong, not through words, but through actions. She knew she had to move carefully, had to be patient. Every step forward had to be taken in secret, away from his dismissive gaze. The fire inside her burned brighter than ever. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing this to show him, to show the world, that she was far more than he ever gave her credit for. The worst moment came at a dinner party hosted by one of his colleagues. It was a gathering of executives, professionals, and their spouses, all engaged in conversations about career advancements and new ventures. As she listened to them speak about their successes, she felt a deep longing to be part of that world. She had always believed she was meant for more than just standing by someone else's side. And yet, that night, she was reminded of just how invisible she had become. As the conversation turned to entrepreneurship, one of the wives asked her if she had ever considered starting something of her own. Before she could answer, her husband let out a loud laugh, drawing everyone's attention. "Oh, she thinks she's a businesswoman," he said, shaking his head. "She had this ridiculous idea a while back, but let's be real, she's not cut out for it." The table erupted in laughter, and she felt her face flush with humiliation. Every word was a dagger to her confidence, yet she forced herself to smile, pretending it didn't bother her. Inside, however, something shifted. She had spent years letting his words define her worth, but that night, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a joke, she made a decision. She would succeed, not just for herself, but to prove every single one of them wrong. She excused herself from the table, went to the restroom, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. One day, she whispered to herself, "They'll regret ever doubting me." And with that, she returned to the dinner, holding her head high, already planning her next move. The next few months were spent in complete secrecy. Every free moment was dedicated to research, strategy, and building the foundation of her business. She used her personal savings, small amounts here and there, carefully withdrawn so her husband wouldn't notice. She found a mentor, an experienced entrepreneur who believed in her vision and was willing to guide her. For the first time in years, she felt alive, driven by something bigger than herself. She worked tirelessly, often waking up before dawn to squeeze in extra hours before starting her usual household responsibilities. She reached out to potential clients, slowly building a network, gaining the confidence that had been stripped away for so long. There were moments of doubt, moments where she wondered if maybe her husband had been right all along. But each time, she pushed forward, fueled by the memory of that dinner party, by the sound of his laughter mocking her. She would not let him win. Even as success started trickling in small victories, but victories nonetheless, she remained silent. She had learned that sharing her progress would only invite more ridicule. So she waited. She waited until the moment was right, until she could reveal everything in a way that would leave him speechless. He thought she was wasting her time. He had no idea that soon, her silly little project would change everything. It wasn't easy. The road to success never is. There were setbacks, failed pitches, and moments of exhaustion so deep she wondered if she could keep going. But each failure was a lesson, each mistake a step closer to her goal. She learned to adapt, to find solutions where others saw dead ends. More importantly, she learned to believe in herself again. Her husband remained oblivious. He barely noticed when she stayed up late, nor did he question why she seemed more energized than before. He had convinced himself that she had given up, that she had finally accepted her place. That arrogance would be his downfall. Because while he was busy looking down on her, she was climbing higher than he ever imagined. Then, one day, it happened, her first major breakthrough. A deal that would change everything. She stared at the contract in front of her, hands trembling as she signed her name. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The beginning of something unstoppable. And the best part? He still had no idea. The night he came home celebrating his promotion, she sat quietly at the dinner table, stirring her soup while he gloated about his new executive title. He went on and on about how his hard work had finally paid off, how he was now in charge of a team, how people respected him. "This is what happens when you stay focused," he said, lifting his wine glass smugly. Then, as if remembering she was there, he looked at her and smirked. "Too bad you wasted all that time on your little project. If you had listened to me, you wouldn't have set yourself up for disappointment." The words stung, but she had learned to control her expression. He had no idea that just that morning, she had received news that would change everything. That very day, she had landed her first major investor. It wasn't just a small client, it was a name that held weight in the industry, someone who saw potential in her work. It was validation, proof that she was onto something real. But instead of celebrating like he did, she remained quiet, watching as he reveled in his self-importance. He still saw her as a failure, as a wife who would never be more than a shadow behind his success. She wanted to tell him, to throw it in his face, but she wasn't ready yet. No, she would wait. She would wait for the moment when he would have no choice but to see her for what she truly was. Despite her victories, doubt still crept in during the quiet moments. There were nights when exhaustion weighed on her so heavily that she questioned whether all of this was worth it. She had spent years convincing herself that she wasn't capable of anything beyond being a housewife. Even with her recent success, there was a part of her that feared it was all temporary, that maybe he was right after all. She had never been given the chance to believe in herself fully, and now, even as she pushed forward, there were times when the insecurities resurfaced. What if she failed? What if all of this was just luck? But then she would remember every time he laughed at her, every time he dismissed her as insignificant. She remembered the humiliation, the feeling of being invisible in her own marriage. And just like that, the doubt would disappear. She wasn't just chasing success, she was reclaiming her dignity. With every deal she closed, every new client she signed, she felt herself growing stronger, more confident. She wasn't the same woman he married. She was becoming something bigger than even she had imagined. And soon, the world, especially him, would see it too. She had been navigating this journey alone for so long that she almost forgot what it was like to have someone believe in her. That changed when she met Olivia, a powerful entrepreneur who had built her own empire from the ground up. Their paths crossed at a networking event, one she attended in secret, pretending to be out shopping while her husband was at work. Olivia, sharp-eyed and confident, immediately saw something in her. "You remind me of myself when I started," she said after listening to her business pitch. "You have the drive. You just need the right push." Olivia became the mentor she never knew she needed, guiding her through the complexities of scaling a business. Under her wing, she learned about negotiation, branding, and expansion in ways she never had before. More importantly, Olivia showed her what it meant to own her power. "You don't need anyone's approval," she told her one evening over coffee. "You just need results." Those words stuck with her. She had spent so many years craving validation from a man who never valued her. But now, she realized that she didn't need his recognition. She just needed to win. The success came at a cost. Late nights turned into early mornings, with only a few hours of sleep in between. She had to be careful, hiding her exhaustion from her husband, who still believed she spent her days idly shopping and scrolling through social media. The house remained spotless, dinner was always prepared, and she never gave him a reason to suspect she was anything but the obedient wife he assumed her to be. But the truth was, she was working harder than she ever had in her life, juggling both worlds, trying to hold everything together. There were nights when the weight of it all became too much. She would sit in her small office, staring at her laptop screen through tear-filled eyes, wondering if she had taken on more than she could handle. But then she would think of the way he spoke down to her, the way he made her feel worthless, and she would find the strength to keep going. No matter how hard it got, she knew she couldn't stop now. She was too close. The foundation was set. The business was growing. And soon, everything would change. The email came in the early hours of the morning, just as she was about to shut her laptop and get a couple of hours of rest. It was from a high-profile company she had been pitching to for months. With shaky hands, she clicked it open, her breath catching as she read the words, "We are interested in moving forward with a partnership." The weight of the moment hit her all at once. This wasn't just another client, this was the turning point. The deal would elevate her business to a level she had only dreamed of. She leaned back in her chair, hands covering her face, as tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. She had done it. She wanted to scream, to celebrate, to tell someone, anyone, but there was no one to share this moment with. Her husband still saw her as nothing, still treated her like she was wasting her time. A bitter smile formed on her lips. Let him think that. Let him enjoy his illusion for a little longer. Because soon, he wouldn't just see her success. He would feel it. He would watch as she soared past him, leaving him in the shadow of his own arrogance. And on that day, he would finally realize the truth: she was never beneath him. He had simply never been able to see her worth. The first major deal changed everything, but she remained silent. She wanted to bask in the victory, to celebrate the fruits of her labor, yet she knew better than to reveal her success too soon. If he found out, he would belittle it, twist it into something meaningless, just as he always did. So she kept her routine unchanged. She still cooked his meals, laughed at his jokes when necessary, and played the role of the passive wife he had molded her into. But behind the scenes, she was negotiating contracts, managing investments, and expanding her business with a level of skill he never thought her capable of. Every day, her world grew bigger while his remained the same. He came home and talked endlessly about his job, his struggles, and how no one in his office worked as hard as he did. Meanwhile, she sat across from him, nodding at all the right moments, hiding the reality that she was now making more money than him. There was an odd sense of satisfaction in knowing that the man who had spent years mocking her was completely oblivious to the empire she was building. She could have told him, she could have thrown it in his face, but no. Not yet. The perfect moment was coming, and when it arrived, he would never recover from it. Success had a way of pulling people into the light, no matter how much she tried to remain in the shadows. At first, it was just emails, messages of congratulations from people in the industry who had heard about her breakthrough. Then came invitations to events, exclusive gatherings where powerful names in business sought her presence. She declined most of them, careful not to arouse suspicion at home. But when one of the biggest firms in the market requested a meeting in person, she knew she couldn't refuse. This wasn't just another client, it was a partnership that could propel her business beyond anything she had imagined. She prepared meticulously, ensuring everything was perfect. Dressed in a tailored suit, exuding confidence she had never felt before, she walked into that meeting not as a woman desperate for approval, but as a force to be reckoned with. And they saw it. They saw her. The deal was sealed within an hour, and as she left the office, she realized something profound: she had arrived. No longer was she the woman he once belittled. She was a name that carried weight. And soon, whether he was ready or not, he would have to acknowledge it. The contract arrived in her inbox a week later, the kind of deal that turned small businesses into industry leaders. It was worth more money than she had ever seen, more than her husband had ever made in his years of climbing the corporate ladder. She sat staring at the screen, letting the gravity of it sink in. It wasn't just about financial security. This was validation, proof that she had been right to believe in herself, even when no one else had. Signing the document felt like closing the door on the years of self-doubt he had planted in her mind. She was no longer chasing success. She was success. But she still wasn't ready to reveal it. Instead, she began making calculated moves, shifting assets, reinvesting profits, and expanding her team. Every decision was precise, every step taken with the foresight of someone who had learned to navigate the business world on her own. And all the while, her husband continued to exist in blissful ignorance. He still came home, tossing casual insults her way, thinking she was wasting time. He still believed she was beneath him. How ironic, she thought. He had spent so long trying to convince her that she would fail, and now, he was the one who had no idea just how small he had become. As her world flourished, his began to show cracks. The company that had once placed him on a pedestal was shifting, younger and more ambitious executives rising through the ranks, challenging the old structure he had relied on for years. He would come home frustrated, venting about how management didn't appreciate experience, about how kids these days didn't respect hard work. She listened quietly, knowing exactly what was happening. He was becoming obsolete. The very arrogance that had made him so dismissive of her was now blinding him to his own downfall. Still, he refused to see himself as anything but superior. When she mentioned an article that praised female entrepreneurs in his industry, he scoffed, waving her off. "Those women are just lucky," he said. None of them would last a day in real corporate competition. The irony was almost laughable. She could have told him then and there that one of the women he dismissed so easily was sitting right across from him. But she didn't. She simply smiled, letting him bask in his ignorance a little longer. Soon, the world he thought he controlled would come crashing down. She could feel the distance growing between them, a silent war neither of them acknowledged but both could sense. He was too caught up in his own struggles to notice that she had stopped needing him entirely. There was a time when his words had the power to hurt her, when his opinions shaped the way she saw herself. But now, she barely felt anything when he spoke. His insults had lost their weight, his presence had become background noise in a life that was expanding beyond him. He was no longer the center of her world. In fact, he was barely a part of it at all. She knew the inevitable was coming. He had spent years treating her as if she were nothing, never once imagining that the tables could turn. But they had. And soon, he would find himself in a position he never expected, powerless, dependent, and at the mercy of the very woman he had mocked. She wasn't waiting for revenge. She wasn't looking for an opportunity to gloat. No, all she wanted was to watch as the realization dawned on him, as he finally understood the depth of his mistake. And when that moment came, she wouldn't have to say a word. The truth would be enough. The inevitable happened sooner than she expected. He came home one evening, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't say anything at first, just sat at the table in complete silence. Then, with a bitter laugh, he finally spoke. "They let me go," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "After everything I've done for them." She watched him, waiting for the moment he would turn his frustration toward her, blame her for something entirely unrelated. But he didn't. He was too stunned, too humiliated to lash out. For years, he had built his identity around his job, convinced that his position made him superior, not just to her, but to everyone around him. Losing it shattered something inside him. He mumbled about loyalty, about how they replaced him with someone younger, someone less experienced but cheaper. The irony was thick. He had spent years dismissing her, assuming she would always depend on him. And now, he was the one lost, without direction, while she thrived in silence. The power shift had begun, though he had no idea just how far it would go. At first, he pretended everything was fine. He assured her it was temporary, that he had connections, that companies would be fighting to hire someone of his caliber. But as weeks turned into months, reality sank in. The job market wasn't what it used to be, and the roles he deemed worthy of him weren't available. He scoffed at lower-paying positions, refusing to stoop that low. His pride kept him from admitting the truth. He was no longer as valuable as he once believed. Meanwhile, she continued to build her empire. She was careful not to let her success slip in front of him, but the signs were there. The subtle changes in their lifestyle, the expensive skincare products she used, the fine dining restaurants she frequented under the guise of catching up with old friends. He noticed, but said nothing, too wrapped up in his own failures to question the shift. He still saw her as insignificant, still clung to the belief that she couldn't possibly be more successful than him. That delusion would not last much longer. His severance pay ran out faster than expected, and soon, bills piled up. The house, once a place of comfort, became a symbol of suffocating financial strain. He started avoiding calls, letting unpaid balances accumulate. He stopped going out, no longer able to afford the lavish lifestyle he once flaunted. And yet, he still refused to admit defeat. Instead, he blamed the world, his old company, the economy, even younger professionals for ruining the industry. But never himself. Never the arrogance that led him here. She watched it all unfold with quiet detachment. She had spent years drowning in humiliation at his hands, but now, as she stood on solid ground, she felt nothing. He was sinking, and unlike him, she wouldn't mock his failure. But she wouldn't save him either. Not yet. He had to learn what it felt like to be dismissed, to be seen as incapable, to have the world look past him the way he had always done to her. Only then would he truly understand the weight of his mistakes. The breaking point came when he finally swallowed his pride and started searching for work beneath his old status. The man who once laughed at others for their mediocre jobs was now applying for positions he had once deemed beneath him. But even those weren't easy to secure. He had spent so many years believing he was untouchable that he never bothered to grow, to evolve. Now, the workforce had moved on without him, leaving him behind like an outdated relic. One afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through job listings, when he came across an article, an industry spotlight on rising entrepreneurs. And there, in bold letters, was her name. His wife. The woman he had dismissed, belittled, laughed at. The woman he never believed in. She wasn't just successful, she was thriving. His hands trembled as he read about her company's growth, the partnerships she had secured, the empire she had built in the very industry he once ruled. His breath caught in his throat as reality crashed down on him. He hadn't just underestimated her. He had lost to her. He didn't confront her immediately. He spent days in a haze, unable to fully process what he had learned. How had she done it? When had she done it? How had he been so blind? The shame was unbearable. He had always assumed she needed him, that without him, she would be nothing. But now, He was the one struggling while she sat atop an empire of her own making. And worse, she had let him believe she was still small, still insignificant. It wasn't just success, this was a quiet, calculated victory. But the day eventually came when he could no longer avoid it. One evening, as she sat working in her office, he walked in, his face pale, his voice hesitant. I saw the article, he admitted, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. She simply looked at him, waiting. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out. I didn't know. I never thought, he trailed off, unable to say what she already knew. He had spent years mocking her dreams, only to find himself at the mercy of the very woman he tried to break. And for the first time in their marriage, she held all the power. The morning he walked into her office as an employee, not a husband, was one he would never forget. She sat behind a grand mahogany desk, the same woman he had once called small, incapable. But there was nothing small about her now. She was poised, powerful, and terrifyingly indifferent. You'll start in the operations department, she said, not even looking up from her paperwork. He swallowed hard, expecting some form of special treatment, some acknowledgement that this was humiliating for him. But she gave him none. She treated him like any other struggling applicant, someone in need of work, nothing more. He wanted to protest, to argue that he was overqualified, but the truth was, he wasn't. He wasn't prepared for this world she had built, a world that thrived without him. He had no other options. He needed the job. And so, with every ounce of pride he had left, he nodded and left the room, starting his first day as a low-level employee in the company of the woman he had once dismissed. His past arrogance felt like a distant memory now. He was no longer the man who looked down on her. He was the man who had to prove he was worth keeping. The first few weeks were brutal. He wasn't used to being ignored, to being just another name on an employee list. He was given mundane tasks, data entry, report filing, tasks he once thought were beneath him. Every morning, he walked into an office where no one knew his past, no one cared about his previous status. To them, he was just another struggling worker trying to keep up. And worst of all, she never acknowledged him outside of meetings. She was his boss, not his wife. At home, the silence between them stretched like an unspoken war. He watched her come and go, taking business calls late into the night, preparing for meetings with people far more powerful than he had ever been. The dynamic had shifted so drastically that he barely recognized their marriage anymore. He wanted to resent her, to blame her for his fall, but deep down, he knew the truth, he had done this to himself. She had only done what he had always said she couldn't. And now, he had to live with it. One afternoon, during a high-profile meeting, he sat in the back, taking notes while she led discussions with investors. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had earned her place at the table, someone who belonged there. Watching her command the room was both humbling and painful. He remembered all the times he had mocked her ideas, all the times he had told her she wasn't capable. And yet, here she was, proving him wrong in every way. After the meeting, one of the senior managers patted him on the back. "Your wife is impressive," he said with admiration. "She built something remarkable." He forced a smile, nodding in agreement. There was no denying it, she had surpassed him in ways he never thought possible. And the worst part? She had done it without him. It was the first time in his life he understood what it meant to respect someone beyond their title. She wasn't just his wife. She was a leader. and for the first time, he saw her as she truly was. The months passed, and he began to see just how much she had endured while he belittled her. He watched as she handled setbacks with grace, as she navigated challenges with intelligence and resilience. Every assumption he had ever made about her was shattered. She had never been weak, he had just been too blind to see her strength. And now, that strength was all he had to rely on. One evening, as he stayed late finishing reports, he saw her alone in her office, massaging her temples, exhausted. It struck him then, she had built all of this while still managing their home, still playing the role of the wife he had expected her to be. And she had done it without support, without validation, without him. The guilt was suffocating. He wanted to say something, to acknowledge the pain he had caused, but words felt meaningless now. What could he possibly say to undo years of dismissal? The breaking point came unexpectedly. It was a simple moment, an investor dinner, one he was invited to as part of her team. As he sat at the table, listening to industry leaders praise her, he felt a deep ache settle in his chest. They spoke about her intelligence, her vision, how she had transformed a struggling market into a thriving empire. "She's the future of this industry," one executive said, raising a toast in her honor. And that was when it hit him, she had become everything he never believed she could be. That night, he couldn't hold it in anymore. As they returned home, he finally spoke. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice hollow. "About everything." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. He expected anger, maybe even satisfaction, but instead, she just nodded. She had known this moment would come. And as he stood there, feeling smaller than ever, he realized the truth. He had spent years trying to break her, but in the end, she was the one who had rebuilt herself stronger than he had ever been. The weight of his admission lingered in the air between them. He had spent years convinced of his own superiority, dismissing her dreams, mocking her ambitions. And now, standing before her as a man who had lost everything, he saw her differently, not as the woman he once controlled, but as the woman he had never truly known. "I was wrong," he repeated, this time softer, almost pleading. "I never saw you for who you are. I never respected you the way I should have." His voice cracked, and for the first time, she saw something real in his eyes, not arrogance, not entitlement, but regret. She took a deep breath, staring at the man she had once loved. She had waited years for this moment, for him to finally understand the pain he had caused. But as she stood there, watching him unravel, she realized something unexpected. His apology, though genuine, didn't change anything. It didn't erase the humiliation, the nights of self-doubt, the years of being belittled. And most of all, it didn't erase the fact that she no longer needed his validation. "I don't need an apology," she finally said. "I just needed to know that you see it now." And with that, she walked away, leaving him to process the truth on his own. Their marriage had become unrecognizable. Once, he had dictated every aspect of their life, assuming she would always be the silent, obedient wife who lived in his shadow. But now, the roles had reversed. He was no longer the provider, no longer the one in control. He worked for her, answered to her, relied on her. And though she never mistreated him, never sought revenge, the distance between them had never been greater. She had outgrown him in ways he never imagined possible. At work, he saw the respect she commanded, the way people looked up to her. And at home, he saw the quiet confidence she carried, the way she moved through life with certainty. He wanted to fix things, to mend what had been broken, but deep down, he knew she had already moved on. Not physically, not yet. But emotionally, mentally, she was already living a life where he was no longer the center. And for the first time in his life, he had to ask himself a question he never thought he'd face. What was he without her? She had spent years fighting for something he never believed in. And now, standing in the empire she built, she saw what had made all the difference. It wasn't luck, it wasn't circumstance. It was belief. Belief in herself when no one else did. Belief that she was capable, even when he made her feel small. She had walked through fire, through humiliation and doubt, and emerged stronger, sharper, unstoppable. And now, as she looked at the man who had once dismissed her, she saw not an enemy, but a lesson. One evening, as they sat in silence, he finally asked, "Did you ever think about leaving me?" She looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something even more unsettling, indifference. "For a long time, I thought I needed you," she admitted. "But now I know I never did." His throat tightened at her words. He had spent so long fearing failure, but this was worse. He hadn't just lost his job. He had lost her. The conversation they had avoided for months could no longer be ignored. He saw it in the way she no longer reached for him, in the way she made decisions without consulting him. She wasn't punishing him. She had simply moved beyond him. And for the first time, he understood there was no going back. "I don't want to hold you back," he said one evening, forcing the words out, even though they shattered something inside him. "If you want to leave, I won't fight it." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, as if she had already made peace with this long before he had. "I think we both know that's for the best," she said, her voice calm, resolute. There was no drama, no anger, just acceptance. He had spent years believing he was the foundation of their life, that without him, she would crumble. But the truth was, he had been the weight holding her down. And now, she was finally free. The divorce was quiet, without theatrics. She had no interest in revenge, in taking more than what was fair. She had already won in every way that mattered. The last time they saw each other, he looked at her with something he had never shown before, genuine admiration. "You did it," he said, almost in awe. "You became everything I never thought you could." She met his gaze, unshaken, unwavering. "No," she corrected. "I became everything I knew I could." As she walked away, stepping into a future unburdened by his doubts, she felt nothing but peace. She had built her own success, forged her own path. And as for him, he would have to live with the knowledge that the woman he had underestimated had not only surpassed him, but had outgrown him completely. And that was the sweetest victory of all.